Hello everyone, in today's video we have a real treat for you. We're going to be comparing performance and looks of the flight simulator versus the performance and looks of the actual real world. Now this has been done a few times before, but I thought I'd go ahead and throw my thing into it. Now we have a couple little modifications in order to make this a little bit better. First of all, in the real world we're flying a Piper Archer 3. In the flight sim here we're flying a Piper Arrow. Unfortunately we don't have an Archer just yet for flight sim, which is unfortunate, but the way we're going to get around this is we're actually going to leave the landing gear down for the flight to kind of simulate the decrease in performance. The other thing we've had to do as far as Liberty goes is that we've had to get the weather as close as we possibly could in the simulator as to what we encountered in the real world. So the way we're going to do this video is we're going to break it up into segments. We're going to start with our taxi, takeoff, climb, then we're going to do a little piece with the cruise, and then we're going to do a little piece with the final approach. Then I'll make a couple comments once we get into Hartford. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So the first big difference, and again, like I said, you'll see a little projection of what it looks like inside the simulator here, is we had just flown up from Hartford into Keene, New Hampshire. Just landed on a runway 2. It was an interesting landing approach because the winds for this particular day were listed as a variable, which was, they weren't joking when they said variable. We came in with a headwind, and by the time we had gotten a little bit lower altitude, next thing you know, we ended up with a tailwind on our final approach. Afterwards, of course, I took a right turn and I started making my way. Again, you can see the real world versus the simulator pretty much right away here on this taxiway towards runway 2 up here in Keene, New Hampshire. One of the big differences you're probably noticing right away is the fact that in the real plane, the plane is bouncing everywhere. It's very, very difficult to keep your head smooth, even with, a really, really nice camera like that, just as you're cruising along here. Another thing worth noting is, we're kind of bouncing around here. It's just the little different details that you can kind of see on the side of the runway. You can see little details as far as how narrow everything is. The positioning of the lighting's different. The positioning of the sign's a little bit different. The visibility that we have out in the sky is a little different as well. Now, it's another thing here, too, is that when we were doing this in the real world, there was actually another couple airplanes in the traffic pattern at this exact time. So one individual, he was in a Vans RV, doing a really, really nice job as far as going ahead and ripping through the pattern. And we had a Cessna 172 that had just finished approaching, and I was just making a quick little landing there. Now, the interesting thing is, about this time, the Vans is just about on downwind, so we called basically to get ourselves directly in front. So far as simulators and differences, again, you can see very clearly the difference in just how stable everything looks. And you also have a very, very good look as far as, how the runway is a little bit different, and as way as just the internals of the airplane is a little different. So we're going to go ahead and execute a regular takeoff here in the sim. Keep in mind, like I said, we're dealing with two different aircraft here. One aircraft is, again, same engine, very, very similar. We're going to do the best we can to try to do the best we have with the Arrow as well. So now takeoff, pretty undramatic here. Like I said, both planes are about the same. I'd say in the sim that the airplane wanted to pull to the left much more aggressively than it did in the real airplane. Lifting the plane into the air, you can see that it was very abrupt in the sim. In the real world, it was much, much smoother kind of a climb out there. Trying to establish that initial climb speed was very challenging in the real plane because of, again, we were very, very high turbulence today. I think there was actually an air met active for a turbulence above us. And of course, the temperature was just oppressive. So it was very, very challenging to try to get that initial climb here. Now, you can see as we're starting to kind of cruise up, a big difference too in the simulator versus the real world is just what the world looks like. You can see very clearly the simulator, everything has got this, very, very bright, I almost want to call it like a super saturated kind of palette thing going on. Whereas in the real world, everything is, I want to call it darker. Obviously, through my sunglasses, things are going to look a little bit different than what they're probably going to look in the real world. So as far as climb out goes, like I said, much, 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 much easier in the sim to hold the exact speed you need to hold. In the real world, you've got a controller that, needs a little bit of oiling. You're fighting control pressures. And of course, as you know, there was another person in the traffic pattern at this time. So what we opted to do here is we opted to actually kind of climb up and around to try to get around all of the different traffic that we saw at the same time as blast past the traffic pattern altitude. You can see us kind of fitzing around a little bit with the GPS, trying to get everything kind of pre-selected. Now, for this particular flight, we opted to get flight following from our good friends over in Boston. They did a really nice job getting us up there, so we, of course, established flight following on the way back down as well. One thing worth noting here is the difference in visibility is pretty staggering. It was definitely a very, very high-pressure day when we had flown. So when you see it over here, things look a little bit on the hazy side, which is not uncommon for this time of year, but it probably was just slightly exaggerated exaggerated. And again, just looking out the window now, you have a pretty good look at, just the differences in colors and differences how easy it is to see things like roads and stuff like that. So at this point, we're going to continue our climb. We limited our climb today up to 3,000 feet, which is definitely a naughty altitude as far as VFR flying goes. But we really didn't have much of a choice on that on account of the fact that there was a lot of clouds on the way up that were right around, I think it was about 4,000 feet. So the problem there is if we wanted to do 4,500 feet, because now we're basically traveling slightly to the west, we run smack into the clouds. Obviously, we could have done VFR on top, but we had no idea what the weather would look like when we got a little bit closer to our destination. So we opted for a more circuitous route like this. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and continue our climb up to 3,000 feet. Again, I'll go ahead and poke out the window here so you can kind of see what it looked like on our little takeoff there. And again, you'll get a chance to see that in the real video as well. You also have Mount Monadnock in the distance. We actually did a nice little donut around Mount Monadnock when we were coming through. And one thing I'm going to say is you can see from the real world video just how incredibly bumpy everything is. That was a tremendously turbulent day. The flight simulator does not do justice to just how bad we were getting bounced around here. So as far as climb performance goes, obviously the Aero is going to do better. Also, in the flight simulator, you don't really get that you get in the real plane because of the really high humidity. I mean, you're getting it visibly here, but you don't get that extra, like, I don't know, the air just gets thick, and like the controls, you get very kind of weird and kind of unresponsive, and everything doesn't quite work nearly as well. What we'll do is go ahead and level off at 3,000 feet. I'll go ahead and set power, and at this point, we've gone ahead and requested a couple little modifications here, and we'll start making our way directly towards Hartford. And what I'll do is I'll pick the video up again when we get a little bit along our cruise. There's 3,000 feet here. Give it a gentle little push. Now, in the real world, it is very easy to level off. It takes just the teeny tiniest push to go ahead and get the aircraft to be able to kind of settle to whatever altitude you need it to. So now that we got that, I'm going to go ahead and set my cruise power here. I'm going to try to keep it. In the real world, because it's a fixed pitch propeller, it is extremely challenging to set your cruise power, because as soon as you set it, one little gust of wind or temperature change and everything's out the window. Another thing we have here is in the flight sim, it is tremendously challenging to set the trim. In the real world, you tap the button once and it's exactly where you want it to be. You're just not working nearly as hard for it. What we do, of course, in the real world too, is on the flight up, we did everything by hand flying. On the flight down, we chose to let the automatic pilot kind of hold the wheel, so to speak, because we're going to be entering into a pretty intense zone as far as air traffic goes. And again, you can see the differences in flight simulator visibility versus the differences in the real world. All right, so we'll pick this up. We'll go ahead and set the autopilot first. This one's a little different than the one we had in the airplane, but that's okay. And then what we'll do is we'll pick it up when we're a little bit further along on our journey. Alright, so we are nice and deep in our cruise in this particular point. I've grabbed the video, so kind of at this point as well. Our GoPro unfortunately overheated twice, as well as the iPad overheated once because of just how incredibly hot it was on this particular day. But the big thing we want to take attention to here is the difference in turbulence. You can see the aircraft in flight sim. I'm just holding my mouse, perfectly similar here. We're just kind of going, not getting ripped around too hard. My ground speed is really substantial here. Remember, we left the landing gear down for this flight. Whoop! Apparently I didn't leave the landing gear down. I must have pushed the button at some point. That's why I was going so fast. But you can see, obviously, the differences in the definition of the mountains that are over on our right there. You can also get a pretty good idea of what the clouds look like. Again, this is their version of this particular level of clouds. The other real world's version of the clouds is a little more broken. They kind of come in bunches. They're not like evenly spread across the world like this. But, all the little lakes, again, you can get a pretty good look at as far as, what they appear in the real world, what they appear in the simulator. And one thing I will say is the autopilot in the simulator is fantastic. The one in the real world does work, but because the air is so uneven, it's constantly hunting, and it is not the world's most accurate tool. So we'll go ahead and fast forward a little bit, and we'll catch you right before we start our descent. All right, so we're just about ready to descend here. You can obviously see kind of the differences visually. One thing that I noticed in the footage that we see, again, this is kind of a function of the lens. The curvature of the Earth is a little bit more obvious. You can definitely see that the clouds here are a bit higher than the clouds that we saw down in up in New Hampshire. It's also worth noting that we have the lovely Bradley International Airport right over on the right. One thing that we're really missing out on in this particular flight simulator is you're not getting the traffic. One of the things we don't get a chance to see, which is is actually kind of a bummer here, is the fact that we had an airliner that we thought was basically going to run us down coming from this direction on the left. And Bradley, we basically started getting ready for evasive maneuvers, and Bradley called us and told them, don't worry about them, they're going to go underneath you. So what we actually ended up doing is climbing up a little extra high here in order to kind of get around it. We got a great view, and like I said, unfortunately the GoPro decided to overheat on us at that point and actually died. So we weren't able to capture a really, really nice United plane basically landing right on the runway that you see right here on the right. So that was really, really dramatic to see. So again, the turbulence, as you can see in the real world footage, was terrific. And again, you can see little differences like the way the window scratches. You can see the way that the propeller changes speed all the time. All those little tiny things really do add up to make a big difference. So what we'll do now is we'll go ahead and get us a little bit closer into the approach. All right, so we started working our descent once we passed the south side of Bradley's airspace there. And now it comes time to actually put the plane on the ground. Now, one thing you're going to probably notice right away is if you look at the buildings on the right, their rendition of Hartford is really, really lacking. And there's a bunch of major industrial buildings. You can see that from the GoPro footage pretty clearly as well. It's a little different. And also the way that highways, bridges kind of the ground, and even the way that the ground up in front of us is a little bit different. Now, the interesting thing with this approach is they were kept changing the runway that was used. One of the things they predicted with the wind here was that it was going to be light and variable. In my opinion, it ended up being more variable and variable. By variable and variable, I mean both in speed as well as in actual direction. So one of the fun things here is when people were landing ahead of us, and unfortunately we can't hear this, you could actually hear them switch everybody around halfway through a pattern. So when I was doing my approach here, I'm sitting there going, oh, great. So, I set up all the regular kind of functionality. One thing I noticed right away that's a big difference. Obviously, we're dealing with a constant speed propeller. We're dealing with, like I said, an arrow instead of an archer here, which is going to have a different personality. So in the real world, you don't get any concept of that cabin angle. One thing you're seeing from the real world footage here is the fact that, first of all, we have a totally different lighting system on the right side of the runway, which, interesting. The other thing you're probably noticing, again, is just the difference in density. You've got like trees that are like big, thick, bushy things. In the flight sim, the trees are these little like thin, see-through things. And you also can see just how much of an impact the changes of wind are during the approach are. In flight sim, this is a vacation. Like it's just set the approach power and on my way, I make my way down to the ground here. In the real world, yikes! That plane was all over the place trying to get that under control as far as performance goes. One of the downsides of those smaller planes is you really, really, really feel all the different bumps as you're kind of coming in for a landing. In the flight sim, you can see me kind of bouncing around every once in a while. But you can see as my altitude changes that the speed of the aircraft changes drastically. The work of the pilot is never done. But that being said, keeping the correct approach speed in the flight simulator is a joke. Like this, I could do this blindfolded. In the real world, it was almost impossible to try to get it at the exact speed that I needed to approach. I'd pull the throttle all the way back, and all of a sudden we'd be close to stall. You'd give it a little bit of nudge. It was a lot. It was actually very tempting to go around at a couple moments. You can see at our last few moments of our approach, you can just watch that windsock being stupid. Where basically our beautiful headwind turned into a tailwind. So that made the final approach very interesting. Coming down to land here, again in the simulator, it's very, very, very easy to be precise here. And the plane just settled really, really nicely. In the real world, it did not want to settle. It basically tried to take back off again when we got caught out gust. But we were still able to get a nice little landing there. We didn't have to fight too hard. Like you said, things were pretty smooth, a little bit further down the runway than I had expected. Then, of course, at that point, the brakes in the real world are not as good as the brakes are in the simulator. You can see it was very, very easy. Of course, you can see we quickly swapping over to different frequencies and everything like that there. We line ourselves up, and I'll go ahead and give Brainerd a call. Now, the interesting thing here that, like I said, this will be a great place to kind of tidy up our video, is the fact that there was other traffic. So one of the things that they did is they gave us permission to taxi via Alpha. By the way, all the taxi signs are wrong here. We should have a taxi sign right there. And we started taxiing by Alpha, and you can see right off at 12 o'clock there that everybody else in the universe was all there ready to go. So we had this really, really fun situation where we had to wait for that other aircraft to go. And one of the interesting things is even though we had permission to go, the other individual there, you can see, basically waited for us to go ahead and pass by. And again, one thing you're probably taking a look at is the ground itself. You can see it's the summer here. So obviously everything's getting a little brown as far as colors goes. You can also see, the aerodynamic positions of a lot of the flight controls and the other aircraft kind of have their own subtlety. The whole recreation of Hartford here is a little bit different. I know there is a marketplace version of Hartford that you can scoop up, which they did a really, really nice job on. But at the same token as it's kind of neat to just see what they can do with the simulator. Obviously, if you look on the left, you can see the totally different aircraft that are represented here. This is a little different in the real world for sure, as well as some of the way some of the buildings goes. It's also worth noting that the condition of the runway, if you look in flight sim, like you can kind of see like where some of the cracks and things are, which are very, very clear. But in the real world, you just have more contrast. It looks a little bit different. And also our sky is much bluer. But again, that's kind of a function of the lens on the camera, less so a function of what we're seeing in the sim here. So what are my final comments and conditions here? First of all, I'm impressed with what Microsoft does. They do a nice job visually. One of the big things they could work on is the density of the trees is just not correct. You could see pretty much every opportunity we flew, the trees are just too thin. You almost have to treat them as if they're, giant spheres of green with a little bit of fuzzy, rather than, super ultra detailed, mini kind of speed tree kind of things like that. Another thing we can take a look at too is the way the weathers are rendered. Obviously, they did a pretty good job as far as simulating it, but there almost needs to be a separate setting in there for turbulence. As far as the performance of the airplane goes, you could see at the lower altitudes where that temperature is really high, the plane just basically refused to fly. That was very, very distinctive. Another thing that was a big, big difference that we saw in the sim as opposed to the real world was the presence of traffic. I've cranked up the traffic to maximum for the purposes of this flight, and during our flight, we encountered multiple traffic. People just ripping through the pattern. We encountered people doing kind of their own thing. We encountered people who weren't on the right radio frequencies. We had airliners crossing in front of us. We had so many different things that we just did not see at all. But that's not the switch we want to push right there. We want to leave that one on. That's the one I'm looking for. As far as the handling and stuff goes, as always, you really cannot compare the flight simulator to the real world. The flight simulator it's so easy to control your speed. Like in the real world, it's all over the place, and just how hard you have to pull this back. Like going from here to here in the real world is it's like lifting weights. It's incredible, and you do not get that. Even though I have a big powerful stick with an extender on it that kind of brings that a little bit more realistic. Obviously, also we have a different plane here. This one was our one that retracted landing gear, so it was slightly different. And of course, you don't get the incredible sensation of heat, or like another thing you probably can't really see in the video is you sit down here. You don't sit up here. It's actually very unrealistic. This is almost more realistic of a seating position in these aircraft. And obviously you can tweak it that way, but you're like, I can't see over the nose. I'm like, yeah, tell me about it. It's actually pretty frustrating. So hopefully you found this video helpful. Like I said, I'd like to recreate some of this in probably a different season with a different aircraft. Do stuff like this with the 182. But this was a super blast, and thanks to Mike for helping me out with the combat camera work there. This was a much easier flight with a second set of hands there. But at the end of the day, like I said, they do a pretty nice job. And if you want to compare it to other flight simulators, again, you can see it on your own. What I would love to see them do is, again, keep working with weather. It's just so much more dynamic in the real world than it is in the flight sim, no matter how you set it. Start designing a weather engine that understands how weather works. How clouds will suck you in, and how your pressure changes, and how your temperatures are constantly changing, and it's always adjusting. Like your altimeter is going like this the entire flight. The other thing is with the turbulence, and the big one too is with the traffic. The real world, you get to a training airport and it's a constant circuit all day. With the traffic jacked up to maximum here, we didn't see anybody. Whereas in the real world, we almost got run over. So again, things we would love to see and kind of improve on. And then, of course, there's the flying. You could see the landing in the real world was pretty challenging because, like I said, the wind was just all over the place. In the flight sim, yeah, the wind was all over the place, but it's just easy and almost mechanical is what I want to call it. Other than that, hopefully you enjoyed this video and have a good one. Enjoy.